Hi, I'm Mara. The first time my family forgot I existed was Christmas morning 2019, when I opened my laptop at the forward operating base in Afghanistan to find a group photo in our family chat. 23 smiling faces gathered around Mom's dining room table, the same mahogany table where I'd carved my initials as a kid. Everyone was there, cousins I hadn't seen in years, neighbors who'd become like family, even old Mrs. Henderson from next door who always complained about our music being too loud. The caption read, "Carter Family Christmas. Wouldn't be the same without everyone we love." I stared at that photo for 10 minutes, counting faces, looking for mine, wondering if maybe I'd just missed it somehow. But no, I wasn't there. I was 8,000 miles away, spending Christmas Day planning tactical operations while my family celebrated like I'd never existed at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 5 years. That's how long I'd been away, serving my country, missing birthdays and holidays, and family barbecues. 5 years of video calls that got shorter and less frequent, of care packages that stopped coming after year 2, of promises to visit that never materialized. I told myself it was normal, that families drift apart when someone's deployed for extended periods. I told myself they understood that what I was doing mattered, even if they didn't really get it. But sitting in that cramped communication tent, staring at 23 faces that should have included mine, something inside me cracked. Not broke, exactly, but cracked like ice on a frozen pond when the temperature shifts. I'd been planning to surprise them for months. My final deployment was ending in 2 weeks, just in time for Christmas 2024. I'd coordinated with my commanding officer, arranged emergency leave, even bought plane tickets with my own money because I wanted to show up at Mom's door on Christmas Eve with my duffel bag, and that stupid grin she always said reminded her of Dad when he was young. The plan had been perfect. I was going to call Mom the night before, tell her I was still overseas, let her go to bed thinking her daughter would miss another Christmas. Then I'd show up at dawn, ring the doorbell, and watch her face light up when she realized her baby girl was finally home. I had imagined that moment so many times during lonely nights in the barracks, during missions that went sideways, during the endless waiting that fills so much of military life. It was the thought that kept me going when everything else felt impossible. Instead, I found myself scrolling through Instagram stories and Facebook posts, watching my family's Christmas unfold without me. There was Jessica, my older sister, posting videos of her kids opening presents under the tree I'd helped Dad pick out 6 years ago. There was Mom in her red apron, the one with the little reindeer on it, ladling gravy over mashed potatoes like she did every year. There was Uncle Pete telling the same terrible jokes he'd been recycling since I was 12, and everyone laughing like they were hearing them for the first time. What hurt wasn't just being excluded. It was how seamlessly the celebration continued without me, like I was a picture that had fallen off the wall and no one had noticed the empty space. They'd filled my absence so completely that there wasn't even a chair left empty in my honor, no toast to Mara, who's serving overseas. Nothing to acknowledge that I existed at all. I called my mom that night, or tried to. It went straight to voicemail, probably because she was busy hosting the Christmas gathering I hadn't been invited to. Her voice sounded bright and cheerful in the recording, the way it always did when she was in her element, surrounded by family and chaos and the controlled disaster of holiday cooking. "Hi, you've reached Linda. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Have a blessed day." I hung up without leaving a message. What was I supposed to say? "Hey Mom, it's your daughter, the one you forgot to invite to Christmas dinner. Just calling from Afghanistan to say hi, and also to ask why my seat at the table was given to the neighbor lady who used to yell at us for playing music too loud." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. It sounded petty even in my head, but the hurt was real and sharp and completely unexpected. That night, I lay in my narrow bunk listening to the distant sounds of the base settling down for the evening. Johnson, in the next bunk over, was snoring softly, and Rodriguez was probably still awake reading one of those romance novels she thought nobody knew about. These people had become my family over the past 5 years, the ones who had my back when bullets were flying, and who shared their care packages when mine stopped coming. They knew me as Sergeant Carter, the woman who could disarm an IED with steady hands, who never flinched under fire, who could motivate a squad through impossible conditions with nothing but determination and dry humor. But lying there in the dark, I felt like 17-year-old Mara again, the girl who'd enlisted straight out of high school because she wanted to do something that mattered, something that would make her family proud. The girl who'd stood in their living room 5 years ago in her dress blues, fresh from basic training, promising she'd come home a hero. They'd been proud then, or at least they'd acted like it. Mom had cried, and Dad had shaken my hand like I was an adult for the first time. Jessica had rolled her eyes but hugged me tight, and even my younger brother Marcus had looked impressed. Somewhere along the way, that pride had faded into indifference. My letters home got shorter responses than no responses at all. My phone calls were rushed, distracted, filled with awkward silences and promises to catch up soon that never materialized. When I tried to share stories about my work, my team, the people we'd helped, the conversations would shift to Jessica's new job, or Marcus's college classes, or Mom's book club drama. It was like my life overseas existed in a parallel universe that occasionally intersected with theirs but never really mattered. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 5 years protecting the freedom for families to gather around Christmas trees, to take silly photos and share inside jokes and complain about politics over dinner. I'd risked my life for that freedom, lost friends defending it, missed my own family celebrations to ensure other families could have theirs. And somehow, in the process, I'd become invisible to the very people I'd been trying to protect. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane from Dubai to Cincinnati, my duffel bag stuffed into the overhead compartment, and my dress uniform hanging in a garment bag that had traveled halfway around the world. I'd decided to stick with my original plan, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I needed to see their faces when I showed up unannounced. I needed to know if they'd be happy to see me or just surprised, if my homecoming would feel like a celebration or an inconvenience. The flight was endless, one of those journeys that exists outside normal time zones and leaves you feeling displaced from reality. I kept thinking about what I'd say when I rang the doorbell, how I'd explain why I hadn't called ahead, whether they'd even have room for me at whatever Christmas celebration they'd planned. Part of me wondered if I should just get a hotel room and call them in the morning, but the stubborn part that had gotten me through 5 years of military service insisted that I belonged in my childhood home, in my family's life, whether they'd remembered to include me or not. I landed in Cincinnati on December 23rd, the terminal decorated with garland and twinkling lights that felt surreal after years of sand and concrete and military precision. Everything seemed too bright, too cheerful, too normal. Families were reuniting all around me, soldiers coming home to tearful embraces and welcome signs, couples meeting after business trips, grandparents greeting grandchildren. I watched a little girl run into her father's arms, watched him spin her around while she squealed with delight, and felt something twist in my chest that I couldn't quite name. The drive from Cincinnati to Riverside took an hour, through familiar highways and past landmarks I'd dreamed about during long nights overseas. The water tower with the faded high school logo, the diner where I'd had my first job washing dishes, the park where I'd learned to drive in Dad's old pickup truck. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, worn around the edges in a way that suggested time had moved forward without me. Riverside in December was exactly as I pictured it during homesick moments overseas. Snow dusted the sidewalks and hung heavy on pine trees, Christmas lights twinkled from houses that looked like something out of a holiday movie, and smoke curled from chimneys into the gray winter sky. It was perfect and peaceful and everything I'd been fighting to protect, but somehow it felt like looking at a postcard of someone else's life. I drove slowly through downtown, past Murphy's Cafe, where the same neon sign flickered like it had since I was a kid, past the VFW hall where Dad used to take me for fish fries on Friday nights, past the little Methodist church where I'd been baptized and confirmed, and where Mom still sang in the choir. At the red light on Main Street, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and was startled by what I saw. The girl who'd left Riverside 5 years ago had been soft around the edges, uncertain about her place in the world. The woman looking back at me had sharp cheekbones and steady eyes, and small scars that told stories she couldn't share with civilians. My parents' house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a front porch that Dad had rebuilt twice, because he could never quite get the measurements right. The Christmas decorations were elaborate this year, more extensive than I remembered from my childhood. Lights outlined every window and door frame, a massive wreath hung on the front door, and inflatable snowmen lined the walkway like festive sentries. It looked like a magazine cover, perfect and welcoming and completely foreign. I sat in my rental car for 10 minutes, engine running, heat blasting, trying to work up the courage to walk up that familiar sidewalk and ring the doorbell. This was my family, my home, the place I dreamed about returning to for 5 years. So why did I feel like I was about to intrude on strangers? Finally, I turned off the engine and grabbed my duffel bag, leaving the garment bag in the car for now. The dress uniform could wait. Right now, I just wanted to see my mom's face when she realized her daughter had come home for Christmas after all. I wanted to hug my dad and tease my siblings and meet my nephew Tyler, who'd been born while I was overseas and who only knew me as a voice on video calls and a face in photographs. The front porch creaked under my boots, the same loose board that had announced my teenage arrival's long past curfew. I could hear voices inside, laughter and conversation, and the clatter of dishes that meant someone was cooking. The smell of Mom's famous sugar cookies drifted through the front door, mixing with pine from the Christmas tree and something savory that might have been her homemade stuffing. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the front window, I could see into the living room where a dozen people were gathered around the Christmas tree. Jessica was there with her husband and kids, and Marcus with his girlfriend Sarah, and several people I didn't immediately recognize. They looked comfortable and happy, settled into an evening that didn't include me, and apparently didn't need me. Before I could talk myself out of it, I rang the doorbell. The conversation inside stopped abruptly, the way it does when no one's expecting visitors. I heard footsteps approaching, and then the door swung open to reveal my mother, Linda Carter, looking exactly the same except for a few more gray streaks in her brown hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to process what she was seeing, like her brain couldn't quite compute that her daughter was standing on her front porch instead of on a military base, 8,000 miles away. "Mara?" she finally whispered. "Hi, Mom," I said, shouldering my duffel bag and trying to smile. Surprise. The silence stretched between us like a chasm I couldn't bridge. Mom's face cycled through emotions faster than I could track them. Shock, confusion, what might have been joy, and then something that looked suspiciously like panic. Behind her, I could hear the conversation in the living room resuming in hushed whispers. People asking who was at the door, speculation about unexpected visitors on Christmas Eve. "What are you doing here?" Mom finally asked, and the words hit me like a physical blow. Not, "Oh my God, you're home," or, "I can't believe it's really you." Just a question that sounded more like an accusation, like I was a door-to-door salesman who'd interrupted their evening instead of her daughter who'd traveled 8,000 miles to spend Christmas with her family. "I'm home," I said simply, adjusting the weight of my duffel bag on my shoulder. "My deployment ended early. I wanted to surprise everyone for Christmas." Mom glanced over her shoulder toward the living room, where I could now make out individual voices. Jessica was explaining something to her kids in the patient tone she used when they were getting restless. Someone laughed at what sounded like one of Uncle Pete's terrible jokes. The sound of normal family life continuing without interruption, without acknowledgement that anything significant was happening at the front door. "Mara, sweetie, this really isn't a good time," Mom said, her voice taking on that careful tone she used when she was trying to manage a situation without causing offense. "We have company over, and the house is just chaos right now. Maybe you could get a hotel room tonight and we could all get together tomorrow?" I felt something cold settle in my stomach, heavier than the winter air creeping through the open door. "A hotel room?" "Mom, I've been overseas for 5 years. I just got home." "I know, honey, I know," she said, stepping closer to the door frame like she was trying to create a barrier between me and the warmth inside. "It's just that we weren't expecting you, and the guest room is being used by your cousin Michelle and her boyfriend, and the couch is covered with presents, and honestly, adding another person to the mix tonight would just be too much." I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. My cousin Michelle, who I saw maybe once every 2 years at family reunions, was sleeping in my childhood home while I was being turned away at the door. The couch I'd slept on during countless sleepovers and movie nights was apparently too valuable as gift storage to accommodate the daughter who'd been serving her country for half a decade. "Who's at the door, Linda?" Dad's voice called from somewhere inside the house, followed by the sound of his footsteps approaching. Robert Carter appeared behind Mom, beer in hand, wearing the same Christmas sweater he'd had since I was in high school. When he saw me, his expression went through the same complicated series of changes as Mom's had. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, but his tone was more bewildered than welcoming. "Mara, what are you doing here?" "Thought you were stuck overseas until next month." "Plans changed," I said. I wanted to surprise everyone. Dad and Mom exchanged a look over my head, one of those wordless conversations that married couples have when they're trying to coordinate their response to an unexpected situation. I'd seen that look pass between soldiers in the field when something went wrong with a mission, and they had to improvise a solution on the fly. "The thing is, kiddo," Dad said, running a hand through his graying hair, "we've got a full house tonight. Michelle and Brad are here from Columbus, and the Hendersons are joining us for dinner, and we've got exactly enough food for the people we were expecting. Your mom's been cooking for 2 days straight to make sure everything's perfect." "I can help with dinner," I offered, desperation creeping into my voice despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I've gotten pretty good at improvising meals with limited resources." "That's not the point," Mom said quickly. "The point is we just weren't prepared for another person. The seating arrangement is already figured out and we don't have another place setting and it would just throw off the whole evening." I stood there on my childhood porch, duffel bag weighing down my shoulder, listening to my parents explain why there wasn't room for me at their Christmas celebration. The same porch where I'd sat waiting for prom dates and processing teenage heartbreak, where Dad had taught me to change a tire, and where Mom had taken 1,000 pictures of me in my cap and gown. Now it felt like enemy territory, a place where I wasn't welcome and didn't belong. Through the window, I could see Jessica getting up from the couch, probably to check on her kids or help with dinner preparations. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was, who knew her place in the family constellation and had never had to question it. I wondered if she even knew I was home, if anyone had bothered to mention that Mara was standing outside in the cold, being politely turned away. "I've been gone for 5 years," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. 5 years, Mom. I missed Tyler's birth, and Emma's first day of school, and Grandma Rose's funeral, and about 100 other family moments because I was serving my country. And now I'm finally home, and you're telling me there's no room for me? "It's not about room, sweetie," Mom said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone that made me feel like I was 12 years old again. "It's about planning and preparation and not disrupting what we've already arranged. You can't just show up unannounced and expect everyone to drop everything and rearrange their lives around you." The words hit me like shrapnel from an unexpected explosion. Drop everything. Rearrange their lives. As if my homecoming was an inconvenience rather than a celebration. As if my presence was a burden rather than a gift. I thought about all the times I'd rearranged my life around their needs. All the phone calls I'd cut short because of time zone differences. All the care packages I'd sent when I could barely afford postage. All the worry I'd carried about their safety and happiness while I was putting my own life on the line half a world away. "Unannounced," I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "I've been gone for 5 years, and my homecoming is unannounced." Dad stepped forward, maybe sensing that the conversation was heading somewhere dangerous. "Now, Mara, let's not get dramatic about this. It's just one night. Tomorrow we can all sit down and have a proper family dinner and catch up on everything." "Dramatic," I said, and I could hear my voice getting sharper despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I'm being dramatic by expecting my family to be happy to see me when I come home from war." "You weren't at war," Mom said quickly, like she'd been waiting for the opportunity to correct me. "You were deployed overseas, but it's not like you were in combat or anything dangerous like that." The statement hung in the air between us like a slap. Not dangerous, not combat. As if the past 5 years had been some kind of extended vacation. As if the medals in my duffel bag and the scars on my body and the nightmares that still woke me up some nights were all imaginary. As if the friends I'd lost and the missions that had gone sideways and the weight of responsibility I'd carried for my team were just stories I'd made up to make myself feel important. Actually, I said, my voice deadly calm in the way that made subordinates pay attention back on base, I've been in plenty of dangerous situations. But you wouldn't know that because you stopped asking about my work about 3 years ago. Mom's face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. That's not fair, Mara. We ask about your work all the time. No, I said. You ask if I'm safe and if I'm eating enough and when I'm coming home. You've never once asked what my job actually involves, or what my team does, or why the missions matter. You just assume it's all paperwork and training exercises, because that's easier than thinking about your daughter in actual danger. We don't want to think about you in danger, Dad said, his voice getting defensive. We're your parents. Of course we don't want to dwell on the scary parts of your job. But you don't want to celebrate the important parts either, I shot back. When I got promoted to sergeant, you forgot to call. When my team received commendations for a successful mission, you changed the subject. When I told you about the schools we helped build and the communities we protected, you acted like I was bragging instead of sharing something I was proud of. The conversation in the living room had gone quiet now, and I realized that everyone inside could probably hear every word we were saying. The thought of my extended family and family friends listening to me argue with my parents on the front porch made my cheeks burn with humiliation. But I was too angry and hurt to stop. That's not true, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. We're proud of your service, Mara. We've always been proud. Are you? I asked. Because when people ask about your kids, you talk about Jessica's promotion at the marketing firm and Marcus's scholarship to Ohio State. You mention me as an afterthought, if at all. Oh, and Mara's in the army somewhere overseas, like I'm deployed to summer camp instead of serving my country. The military was your choice, Dad said, and there was an edge to his voice now that suggested his patience was wearing thin. We supported your decision, but we never pretended to understand it. You could have gone to college like your brother and sister. You could have stayed here and built a life close to family. Instead, you chose to disappear for 5 years and then show up unannounced, expecting everything to revolve around you. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with precision that suggested they'd been thought but never spoken before. Disappear, expecting everything to revolve around me. As if my service was selfishness rather than sacrifice, as if my absence was abandonment rather than duty. I didn't disappear, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I served my country. I defended the freedoms that let you sit in your warm house having Christmas dinner without worrying about bombs or bullets or whether your children will come home alive. Don't lecture us about freedom, Mom snapped, her composure finally cracking. We know what freedom is. We didn't need you to go halfway around the world to protect it. The statement hung between us like a chasm that couldn't be bridged. Everything I'd believed about my service, about my sacrifice, about the importance of what I'd been doing for the past 5 years, suddenly felt naive and pointless. If my own family didn't think my service mattered, if they saw it as a choice to abandon them, rather than a commitment to protect them, then what had it all been for? Mara? Jessica's voice came from behind our parents, and I looked past them to see my sister approaching the door with a confused expression. What's going on? Someone said they heard your voice, but that's impossible because you're overseas. Hi, Jess, I said, trying to smile despite the tears I could feel threatening. Surprise. Jessica's face lit up with genuine joy, the first real welcome I'd received since ringing the doorbell. Oh my God, Mara, you're home. Why didn't you tell us you were coming? She pushed past our parents and pulled me into a fierce hug that smelled like her familiar perfume and sugar cookies and home. For a moment, I let myself believe that everything would be okay, that Jessica's excitement would override our parents' reluctance, and I'd be welcomed into the warm chaos of family Christmas. But when she pulled back and looked at the 3 of us standing in the doorway, I could see her taking in the tension and the tears in Mom's eyes, and the way Dad was holding himself like he was bracing for a fight. What's wrong? She asked, looking between us. Why does everyone look upset? Mara, you should come inside. It's freezing out here. There's no room, I said simply, and Jessica's expression shifted to confusion. What do you mean there's no room? It's Christmas Eve, and you just got home from deployment. Of course there's room. The house is full, Mom said quickly. Michelle and Brad are staying in the guest room, and we have dinner planned for exactly the number of people we were expecting. And adding another person at the last minute would just create chaos. Jessica stared at our mother like she'd spoken in a foreign language. Mom, this is Mara. She's been gone for 5 years. She's not another person, she's family. Of course she's family, Dad said defensively. But that doesn't mean we can just ignore practical considerations. We don't have enough food, we don't have enough chairs, we don't have anywhere for her to sleep. Then I'll give her my room, Jessica said immediately. Tom and I can sleep on the air mattress in the basement with the kids. Problem solved. The offer was so immediate and generous that it made my throat tight with gratitude. At least one person in my family was happy to see me. At least one person thought my homecoming was worth a little inconvenience. That's not the point, Mom said, her voice getting sharper. The point is that Mara can't just show up without warning and expect everyone to drop everything and accommodate her. We've been planning this Christmas for weeks, and everything is perfectly arranged, and now she wants to waltz in here and disrupt everything because she decided to surprise us. She's been deployed for 5 years, Jessica said, her voice rising in disbelief. She's been serving our country for 5 years, and you're worried about disrupting dinner plans? Don't act like we're not proud of her service, Dad said quickly. Of course we're proud. But pride doesn't change the practical realities of the situation. I listened to them argue about me like I wasn't standing right there, like I was a logistical problem to be solved rather than a daughter who'd come home for Christmas. The cold was seeping through my jacket now, and I could feel my fingers going numb around the handle of my duffel bag. Inside the house, I could hear Tyler asking someone why everyone was yelling, his little voice confused and worried. Stop, I said quietly, and something in my tone made everyone turn to look at me. Just stop. I looked at my parents. Really looked at them, and saw strangers wearing familiar faces. These were the people who'd raised me, who'd kissed my scraped knees and celebrated my achievements, and sent me off to basic training with tears in their eyes and pride in their voices. But somewhere along the way, they'd stopped seeing me as their daughter, and started seeing me as an obligation, a complication, a choice they didn't quite approve of. I get it, I said, and my voice sounded calm and controlled, even though I felt like I was breaking apart inside. I understand that my homecoming isn't what you wanted for Christmas. I understand that I should have called ahead and made arrangements and not assumed that my family would want to see me after 5 years away. Mara, that's not what we're saying, Mom started, but I held up a hand to stop her. It's exactly what you're saying, I said. And you know what? You're right. I should have called. I should have made a reservation at a hotel. I should have known better than to think that coming home would feel like coming home. I shouldered my duffel bag more securely and turned toward the rental car parked in the driveway. I'll get a room at the Hampton Inn out by the highway. Maybe we can have coffee sometime this week and catch up. Mara, wait, Jessica called, but I was already walking down the porch steps. Don't, I said without turning around. Don't make this harder than it already is. I reached the car and threw my duffel bag into the back seat with more force than necessary. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. Whether from cold or emotion, I couldn't tell. Behind me, I could hear Jessica arguing with our parents, her voice getting louder and more upset as she defended my right to be welcomed home. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of faces in the living room window. Cousin Michelle and her boyfriend, looking curious about the drama playing out in the driveway. Uncle Pete with his beer in hand, probably wondering if this would become another family story to be retold and analyzed for years to come. Mrs. Henderson from next door, the same woman who'd complained about our music for years, and who was apparently more welcome at my family's Christmas than I was. I backed out of the driveway slowly, giving them one last chance to come running after me, to realize what they were doing and call me back. But the front door stayed closed, and the argument on the porch continued without resolution, and I drove away from my childhood home feeling more alone than I'd ever felt during 5 years of deployment overseas. The Hampton Inn was exactly what I'd expected. Clean, generic, and utterly impersonal. The desk clerk wished me a Merry Christmas with professional cheerfulness, and I paid for 2 nights with the credit card I'd barely used during my deployment. The room was on the 2nd floor, with a view of the highway and a heater that rattled when it kicked on. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone, trying to decide who to call. Not my parents, obviously. Not Marcus, who was probably still at the house enjoying the Christmas celebration I'd been excluded from. Jessica had texted me 3 times already, but I wasn't ready to deal with her guilt and apologies and attempts to fix what couldn't be fixed. Finally, I scrolled through my contacts until I found Sergeant Rodriguez's number. She'd be home in Texas by now, spending Christmas with her own family, but she'd been my closest friend during deployment and the only person who might understand how I was feeling. Carter? Her voice was surprised but warm when she answered. What the hell are you doing calling me? Shouldn't you be stuffing your face with your mom's cooking right about now? Change of plans, I said, and something in my voice must have alerted her, because her tone shifted immediately. What happened? I told her everything, from the Christmas photo that had started it all, to the conversation on the porch that had ended with me sitting alone in a hotel room on Christmas Eve. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief or anger, but letting me get the whole story out before responding. Jesus, Carter, she said finally. That's fucked up. Thanks for the sympathy, I said dryly. No, I mean it's really fucked up. You've been gone for 5 years, and they act like you showing up is an inconvenience? What the hell is wrong with people? Maybe they're right, I said, voicing the doubt that had been growing since I'd left the house. Maybe I should have called ahead. Maybe showing up unannounced was selfish. Bullshit, Rodriguez said firmly. You know what's selfish? Having a Christmas celebration and not even saving a chair for your daughter, who's been deployed overseas. You know what's inconsiderate? Acting like military service is a hobby instead of a sacrifice. Her certainty was comforting, but it also made the contrast with my family's reaction even more painful. My Army family understood what I'd given up to serve. My biological family saw it as a choice that had inconvenienced them. What am I supposed to do now? I asked. You're supposed to remember who you are, Rodriguez said without hesitation. You're Sergeant Mara Carter. You've led teams through impossible situations. You've saved lives. You've made decisions under pressure that most people couldn't handle on their best day. You're not some lost little girl begging for scraps of attention from people who don't appreciate what they have. They're my family, I said weakly. Family is supposed to have your back, she replied. Family is supposed to celebrate when you come home safe. If they can't do that, then maybe the problem isn't with you. After we hung up, I sat in the hotel room's silence and tried to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, I'd been planning the perfect homecoming surprise. Now I was spending Christmas Eve alone in a hotel room, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake in thinking my family would want me back. My phone buzzed with another text from Jessica. I'm so sorry, they're being horrible and I don't understand it. Can we please talk? I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. Not tonight, need time to think. Outside my window, snow was beginning to fall again, coating the highway and the parking lot in fresh white that made everything look clean and peaceful. Christmas lights twinkled from the restaurant across the street, where other travelers were probably spending the holiday away from home. I wondered if any of them were soldiers like me, if any of them had expected a different kind of homecoming than the one they'd received. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and I had no idea what I was going to do with it. I could drive back to Cincinnati and catch a flight to somewhere else, start over in a new city where no one had expectations or disappointments about who I should be. I could show up at my parents' house again and demand the welcome I deserved. I could check out of the hotel and disappear for another 5 years, let them wonder if they'd ever see me again. But as I lay down on the hotel bed, still fully clothed, I realized that none of those options would fix what was really broken. The problem wasn't just that my family had excluded me from Christmas dinner. The problem was that, somewhere along the way, they'd stopped seeing me as someone worth including at all, and I wasn't sure that could be fixed with apologies or explanations or even time. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, I could hear my mother's voice asking, "What are you doing here?" Like my presence in my childhood home was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Tomorrow, I decided, I would figure out what I was doing here. And if the answer was nothing, then I would figure out where I belonged instead. Christmas morning dawned gray and quiet, the kind of overcast December day that made everything look muted and forgettable. I woke up in the hotel room with a crick in my neck and the taste of disappointment still bitter in my mouth. For a moment I forgot where I was and why I was there, reaching instinctively for the familiar sounds of reveille and morning formation that had structured my days for 5 years. Instead, I got the distant hum of highway traffic and the artificial cheerfulness of a weather reporter on the local news channel I'd left running all night. I lay there for a while, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of some country I'd never been to, trying to decide what to do with the day. Back on base, Christmas had been a subdued affair. Those of us who couldn't get home leave had made the best of it with improvised traditions and care packages from home. It had been lonely, but it had also been peaceful in its own way. There was something to be said for spending the holiday with people who understood that sometimes family was the people who chose to stand beside you, not the ones who happened to share your DNA. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since dawn with messages I wasn't ready to read. Jessica, probably. Maybe Marcus, if he'd figured out what had happened. Possibly my parents, though I doubted they'd waste Christmas morning on apologies when they had a house full of guests to entertain. I let the messages pile up unread, and focused instead on getting dressed and figuring out what the hell I was going to do with myself. The Hotel Continental breakfast was exactly what you'd expect. Watery coffee, stale pastries, and orange juice that tasted like it had been made from powder. I sat at a small table by the window, watching families load luggage into their cars and head home after Christmas visits. A little girl in a red coat was showing her grandmother a new doll, spinning in circles in the parking lot while the adults loaded presents into the trunk. The scene was so perfectly normal, so utterly removed from my own complicated reality that I felt like I was watching it through glass. I was on my second cup of terrible coffee when I finally worked up the courage to check my messages. 17 texts, mostly from Jessica, each one more frantic than the last. The progression told a story of its own. Confusion, anger, determination, and finally what looked like a plan forming. Mara, please call me. This is insane, and I'm not letting it stand. I talked to Tom and we're gonna fix this. You shouldn't be spending Christmas alone in a hotel. Mom and Dad are being stubborn and stupid. They think you'll just get over it and everything will go back to normal. I have an idea. Don't do anything drastic. I'll call you in an hour. The last message had come in 20 minutes ago, which meant Jessica's phone call was imminent. I drained my coffee and headed back to my room. Not sure I was ready for whatever plan my sister had cooked up, but curious enough to stick around and find out. She called while I was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at my dress uniform hanging in the garment bag I'd brought from the car. The blues looked foreign and official in the bland hotel room, like they belonged to someone else entirely, someone more important and accomplished than the woman who'd been turned away from her own family's Christmas celebration. "Thank God you answered," Jessica said without preamble. "I was worried you'd already left town or done something dramatic." "Like what?" I asked. "I don't know. Enlisted for another 5 years out of spite." "You always were. Stubborn when people hurt your feelings. Despite everything." I almost smiled. Jessica knew me well enough to predict my defensive reactions. The way I'd always dealt with rejection by throwing myself into something that proved I didn't need the people who'd rejected me. The thought crossed my mind, I admitted. "Well, don't. Because I have a better plan." Jessica's voice had that determined quality it got when she was about to bulldoze through obstacles with pure force of will. "Do you still have your dress uniform with you?" I looked at the garment bag. "Yeah, why?" "Because you're coming to Christmas dinner today, and you're going to walk in there looking like the war hero you are, and Mom and Dad are going to remember exactly who their daughter is and what she's accomplished." "Jess, they made it pretty clear last night that I'm not welcome." "They made it clear that they're idiots," Jessica corrected. "But they're fixable idiots, and I'm going to fix them. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to show up at 2 o'clock when everyone's gathered for dinner. You're going to walk in wearing your uniform and every medal you've earned, and you're going to let them see exactly what they were turning away last night." The plan was bold and dramatic and exactly the kind of thing that would either backfire spectacularly or force a reckoning that was long overdue. I could picture it. Walking into the dining room in my dress blues while everyone was gathered around the table. The sudden silence. The shock on faces that had been content to exclude me 24 hours earlier. "I don't know," I said. "It feels like grandstanding." "Good," Jessica said firmly. "Grandstand. Make them uncomfortable. Make them face what they did and who they did it to. You've spent 5 years being humble about your service because that's who you are, but maybe it's time for them to see exactly what humility has been hiding." I thought about Rodriguez's words from the night before, about remembering who I was and what I'd accomplished. The medals in my duffel bag weren't decorations or props. They were recognition of real achievements, real sacrifices, real moments when I'd chosen duty over comfort and service over safety. Maybe it was time my family saw them not as abstract symbols but as evidence of the woman I'd become while they weren't paying attention. "What about Mom and Dad?" I asked. "They're going to be furious that you're ambushing them." "Let them be furious," Jessica said. "They should be furious at themselves for treating their daughter like an inconvenience." "Do you know what happened after you left last night?" "I'm afraid to ask." Marcus lost his shit. Completely lost it. Started yelling at Mom and Dad about how they'd just turned away their daughter, who'd been serving overseas. How they were acting like selfish children. How ashamed he was to be related to them. He grabbed Sarah and left. Said he wasn't staying for Christmas dinner if that's how they treated family. I was quiet for a moment, processing this. Marcus and I had always been close despite the age gap, but he'd never been one for dramatic confrontations. If he'd walked out on Christmas Eve, it meant the situation was even worse than I'd thought. Where did he go? "He's staying at my house, so are Tom and the kids. We decided that if Mom and Dad want to have Christmas dinner without their children, they can explain to the cousins and neighbors why 3 of their 4 kids aren't there." The implications of this hit me slowly. Jessica wasn't just suggesting I show up for dinner. She was orchestrating a full family rebellion, a coordinated effort to force our parents to confront their choices and their consequences. "You're going nuclear," I said. "They went nuclear first," Jessica replied. "We're just responding in kind. The question is, are you with us? Or are you going to let them win by default?" I thought about spending Christmas Day alone in the hotel room, ordering room service and watching holiday movies on cable, while my family either imploded or found a way to function without me. I thought about driving back to Cincinnati and catching the first flight to anywhere else, disappearing again, and letting them wonder if they'd ever see me again. Both options felt like surrender, like accepting their judgment that I wasn't worth the inconvenience of an extra place setting. "What time did you say?" I asked. 2 o'clock. "Dinner's at 2:30, so everyone will be gathered and settled. Maximum impact." "And you'll be there?" "We'll all be there. Marcus, Sarah, Tom, the kids. United front. They can turn away 1 daughter, but they can't turn away 3 of their 4 children without looking like exactly what they are." I looked at my dress uniform again, imagining how it would look in my childhood dining room. The deep blue fabric with its precise creases. The ribbons and medals that told the story of 5 years spent serving something larger than myself. The insignia that marked me as someone who'd earned respect through actions rather than inheritance. It would be a statement, certainly. The question was whether it would be the right statement. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll do it." "Thank God," Jessica breathed. "I was worried you'd given up on us entirely." "I haven't given up," I said, "but I'm not going to keep pretending that what happened last night was okay either. If they want to treat me like a stranger, they're going to find out exactly who this stranger is." After we hung up, I spent 2 hours getting ready with the kind of precision I'd learned in the military. Every detail mattered when you were making a statement. The perfect alignment of ribbons, the mirror shine on shoes, the exact positioning of every element that would contribute to the overall impression. I'd worn this uniform to ceremonies and formal events, but never to a family dinner. It felt strange and powerful, like putting on armor for a battle I'd never expected to fight. The drive to my parents' house took 15 minutes, but I circled the block twice before parking, checking my appearance in the rearview mirror, and rehearsing what I might say. The neighborhood looked different in daylight, smaller and more ordinary than it had seemed the night before. Christmas decorations that had looked magical in the darkness now looked slightly desperate, as if everyone was trying too hard to create the perfect holiday atmosphere. There were more cars in the driveway and along the street than there had been the previous evening. The full guest list, apparently, plus whatever neighbors and friends had been invited to witness what my parents probably thought would be a perfectly normal Christmas celebration. I wondered if they'd told anyone about the scene on the porch, if they'd explained why I wasn't there, or if they'd simply acted like I didn't exist. I sat in the car for a few more minutes, watching people move past the windows inside. The dining room was visible from the street, and I could see figures gathered around the table, the warm glow of candles and the sparkle of good china. It looked like a magazine spread, the perfect American Christmas scene. All it was missing was the daughter who'd spent 5 years defending the freedom that made such scenes possible. At exactly 2 o'clock, I got out of the car and walked up the front sidewalk. My heels clicked against the concrete with military precision, and I could feel the weight of my ribbons and medals with each step. The Christmas decorations looked different from this angle, more desperate than festive, like props in a play where everyone had forgotten their lines. I didn't ring the doorbell this time. Instead, I used my key, the same key I'd carried through 5 years of deployment, wrapped in a small cloth bag that had traveled with me through 3 countries and dozens of forward operating bases. It still fit perfectly, still turned with the smooth ease of a lock that recognized its proper key. The front door opened onto the familiar chaos of Christmas dinner preparation. I could hear conversation and laughter from the dining room, the clink of silverware against china, someone telling a story that was generating the kind of appreciative murmurs that meant it was either very funny or very heartwarming. The house smelled like turkey and stuffing and Mom's famous apple pie, all the scents that had defined Christmas throughout my childhood. I paused in the front hallway, adjusting my uniform jacket and checking my posture. Everything had to be perfect for this moment, not because I was trying to show off, but because I was representing something larger than myself. I was representing every service member who'd ever been misunderstood or undervalued by the people they'd sworn to protect. I was representing the version of myself that my family had refused to see. The conversation in the dining room was getting louder and more animated, probably because someone had opened a second bottle of wine and Uncle Pete was warming up to tell his annual story about the Christmas he'd gotten snowed in at the airport in Buffalo. It was a good story, one I'd heard dozens of times, and part of me felt a pang of nostalgia for the simplicity of family traditions and shared history. But that simplicity was an illusion, I realized. It only worked when everyone agreed to pretend that uncomfortable truths didn't exist. When everyone played their assigned roles without questioning why some people got speaking parts while others were relegated to the background. I walked toward the dining room with measured steps, my military bearing automatic after years of practice. Through the doorway, I could see the gathering exactly as I'd imagined it. 20 people crowded around the extended table, faces flushed with warmth and wine, and the comfortable pleasure of familiar company. Mom was carving the turkey with ceremonial precision while Dad opened another bottle of wine. Cousin Michelle was telling some story about her job in Columbus while her boyfriend nodded along politely. And there, at the far end of the table, were Jessica and Marcus and their families, watching the doorway with expressions of barely contained anticipation. Jessica caught my eye first and gave me the smallest possible nod of encouragement. Marcus straightened in his chair, preparing for whatever was about to happen. I stepped into the doorway and waited. The conversation didn't stop immediately. It took a few seconds for people to notice the figure in uniform standing at the entrance to the dining room, a few more seconds for recognition to dawn, and then the silence spread across the table like ripples in a pond. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Wine glasses stopped moving. Even Uncle Pete's story trailed off mid-sentence as he turned to see what had captured everyone's attention. Mom looked up from the turkey and went completely still, the carving knife frozen in her hand. Dad's mouth fell open slightly, like he was trying to process what he was seeing. The neighbors and extended family members looked confused but impressed, clearly recognizing military dress uniform, even if they weren't sure why it was appearing at their Christmas dinner. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the soft Christmas music playing in the background and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stood at attention, letting them take in the full impact of what they were seeing. Not the daughter they'd turned away last night, but Sergeant Mara Carter, decorated veteran, woman who'd earned every ribbon and medal displayed on her chest through 5 years of service they'd never bothered to understand. Finally, Mrs. Henderson from next door broke the silence. "My goodness," she said, her voice filled with genuine awe. "Look at all those medals. Mara dear, you look absolutely magnificent." The compliment seemed to break whatever spell had held the room frozen. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, voices overlapping in a confused jumble of questions and exclamations and attempts to understand what was happening. "Mara, what are you doing here?" Mom's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with the kind of controlled panic that meant she was trying to manage a situation that had already spiraled beyond her control. "I'm home for Christmas," I said simply, my voice carrying the clear authority I'd learned to project when addressing a room full of people. "I thought I'd join the family celebration." "You can't just walk in here uninvited," Dad said, his face reddening with what looked like embarrassment rather than anger. "We discussed this last night. Actually," Jessica said, standing up from her chair with deliberate slowness. "I invited her." "We all did." She gestured to Marcus and their families. "Because that's what family does. We invite each other to Christmas dinner." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see people around the table beginning to piece together what had really happened the night before. Cousin Michelle was looking between my parents and me with growing comprehension. Uncle Pete had set down his wineglass and was studying my uniform with the kind of attention that suggested he was finally understanding exactly who I was and what I'd been doing for the past 5 years. "Those are real medals," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Jesus, Mara, what did you do over there?" The question was the opening I'd been waiting for, the chance to finally tell my family exactly what their daughter had accomplished while they weren't paying attention. I straightened my shoulders and looked around the table, meeting eyes with each person in turn. "I served as a sergeant in special operations," I said, my voice clear and professional. "I led teams in counterterrorism operations, helped coordinate humanitarian aid distribution, and assisted in training local security forces. I was awarded the Bronze Star for actions during a mission that helped evacuate civilians from a combat zone, and the Purple Heart for injuries sustained during an IED attack that I helped my team survive." The silence that followed was different from the first one, deeper, more thoughtful, heavy with the weight of information that was forcing people to completely recalibrate their understanding of who I was. I watched faces around the table process what I'd said, watched the shift from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like respect. "You never told us about any of that," Mom said weakly. "I tried," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Every time I called home, every time I tried to share what my work involved, the conversation got changed to something else. You didn't want to hear about the dangerous parts or the important parts. You wanted to hear that I was safe and eating enough and coming home soon." "We were worried about you," Dad said defensively. "You were worried about yourselves," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp with anger I'd never heard from him before. "You were worried about having to think about your daughter in danger, so you pretended she wasn't. You turned her service into something abstract and unimportant because that was easier than dealing with the reality of what she was doing." The accusation hit its target, and I could see Dad flinch. Around the table, the extended family and neighbors were watching this family drama unfold, with the kind of fascinated horror that meant this Christmas dinner would be talked about for years to come. "That's not fair," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. "What's not fair?" Jessica said, her voice rising with emotion, "is treating your daughter like an inconvenience when she comes home from 5 years of military service. What's not fair is telling her there's no room for her at Christmas dinner while you're hosting neighbors and distant cousins." I could see Mrs. Henderson looking uncomfortable at being indirectly referenced as more welcome than the family's own daughter. Cousin Michelle was staring at her plate like she wished she could disappear entirely. The uncomfortable truth was settling over the gathering like a heavy blanket, forcing everyone to confront the ugly reality of what had happened. "I think," I said quietly, and my voice carried enough authority to cut through the rising tension, "that we all need to be honest about what's really happening here. I walked further into the room, my uniform making small sounds as I moved, the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet click of metals against each other. Every step was deliberate, measured, designed to project the confidence and competence I'd learned in the military. For 5 years I've been serving my country, I continued, looking around the table. I've missed birthdays and holidays and family milestones because I was doing a job that mattered. A job that helped keep people safe. And for 5 years my family has been telling themselves a story about that service that made it easier to ignore what I was actually doing. I paused, letting the words sink in. You convinced yourselves that my deployment was some kind of extended summer camp, that my work wasn't really dangerous or important, that I chose to disappear rather than serve. It was easier to be hurt by my absence than to be proud of the reason for it. The truth was harsh but necessary, and I could see it landing with the force of recognition around the table. Dad was staring at his hands, Mom was blinking back tears, and even the guests were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something bigger than a family squabble. But here's what I don't understand, I said, my voice getting stronger. How do you look at someone in uniform, someone wearing medals earned through service and sacrifice, and see an inconvenience rather than a hero? How do you turn away your own daughter when she comes home from war? The question hung in the air like a judgment, and I could see people around the table struggling to find an answer that didn't make them complicit in something ugly and small-minded. It was Mrs. Henderson who finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "We didn't know," she said simply. "Mara, dear, we had no idea what you'd been doing or what you'd accomplished. We just knew you were overseas somewhere, doing something in the military." I looked at her, this woman who'd been more welcome at my family's Christmas table than I had been, and saw genuine regret in her eyes. "That's because they never told you," I said. "They never told anyone, because they never bothered to learn." The accusation was stark and undeniable, and I watched my parents struggle to find a defense that didn't exist. How could they argue with the evidence standing in front of them, with the uniform and medals and bearing that spoke to accomplishments they'd never bothered to understand? "We're proud of you," Mom said finally, her voice small and defeated. "We've always been proud." "No," I said, and my voice was gentle but implacable. "You've been politely tolerant. There's a difference." The words hit home, and I could see the impact in the way Mom's face crumpled, the way Dad's shoulders sagged with the weight of recognition. Around the table, the extended family was beginning to understand that they'd been witnesses to something much uglier than they'd realized. "I think," Uncle Pete said slowly, setting down his wine glass with deliberate care, "that maybe we all owe Sergeant Carter an apology." The use of my rank was intentional and pointed, and I felt a surge of gratitude for this man who'd been telling the same terrible jokes for 20 years but who understood respect when he saw it. "More than an apology," Cousin Michelle said quietly. "We owe her the welcome she should have received last night." I looked around the table, taking in faces that were beginning to show shame and regret, and the dawning understanding of what they'd participated in. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I was no longer the inconvenient daughter begging for acceptance, but the decorated veteran who'd been wronged by people who should have known better. "The question now," I said, looking directly at my parents, "is what we do next." The silence that followed my question was thick, with tension and unspoken truths. I could see my parents struggling with something deeper than embarrassment, the dawning realization that they'd fundamentally misunderstood not just my service, but who I'd become during those 5 years away. Mom's hands were trembling as she set down the carving knife, and Dad looked like he was aging in real time as the weight of what had happened settled over him. But it was Mrs. Henderson who broke the silence with a question that changed everything. "Mara, dear," she said, her voice gentle but curious, "you mentioned counterterrorism and humanitarian work. Were you perhaps involved in that operation last year? The one where American forces helped evacuate the girls' school when those extremists attacked?" I felt my breath catch. That mission was classified in its details, but the broad strokes had made international news. A coordinated evacuation of over 200 schoolgirls from a compound under siege. An operation that had required precise timing and exceptional courage from the teams involved. I'd been the lead sergeant on the tactical coordination. the one who'd helped design the evacuation routes and coordinate with local forces to ensure the girls' safety. Yes, I said simply. I was there. The impact of that single word was immediate and dramatic. Uncle Pete's wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. Cousin Michelle's eyes went wide with recognition. Even the neighbors who'd been politely confused about the family drama suddenly straightened in their chairs with new attention. You were part of that? Mrs. Henderson's voice was filled with awe. But that was on the national news for weeks. They said it was one of the most successful humanitarian operations in recent military history. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, the way it did when people suddenly realized they were in the presence of someone whose story was bigger than they'd imagined. But there was something else happening too. I could see my parents' faces changing as they began to understand that their daughter hadn't just been serving overseas, but had been part of operations that made international headlines. The news reports said American forces worked with local partners to save over 200 girls. Dad said slowly, his voice filled with something that might have been wonder. That was you? That was my team, I corrected. I was the sergeant in charge of tactical coordination, but it took dozens of people working together to make it happen. Jessica was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pride mixed with something that looked almost like shock. Mara, why didn't you ever tell us about that? When it was on the news, you never mentioned you were involved. I thought back to the phone call I'd made home a few days after that mission, when the adrenaline had finally worn off and I'd needed to hear familiar voices, needed to feel connected to something normal and peaceful. I'd tried to share what had happened, tried to explain the complexity of the operation and what it had meant to see those girls safely evacuated. But the conversation had quickly shifted to Jessica's problems at work and Mom's concerns about the neighbor's noisy dog, and I'd realized that my family wasn't equipped to handle the reality of what I was doing. I tried, I said quietly. I called home a few days after it happened, but when I started to explain what we'd done, Mom changed the subject to ask if I was eating enough vegetables. The words hit Mom like a physical blow. I could see her trying to remember that conversation, trying to recall what she'd missed or dismissed. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking as she reached for her water glass. I remember that call, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You said something about a successful mission and I asked about your diet because I was worried you weren't taking care of yourself. You were always worried about the wrong things, Marcus said, his voice sharp with frustrated anger. You worried about whether she was eating enough and sleeping enough and staying warm enough, but you never worried about whether she was doing something incredible that deserved recognition. Around the table, I could see the guests beginning to piece together a story they'd never heard before. These people had known me since I was a child, had watched me grow up in this house in this neighborhood, but they'd never understood what I'd become or what I'd accomplished. To them, I'd been Linda and Robert's youngest daughter, who'd joined the military and disappeared overseas. Not Sergeant Mara Carter, who'd helped coordinate operations that saved lives and made headlines. There's more, I said, because suddenly I was tired of hiding my accomplishments, tired of downplaying my service to make other people comfortable. The Bronze Star I mentioned? That was for an operation where my team helped evacuate a village that was under attack. We got 43 civilians out safely, including 12 children under the age of 10. I could see Uncle Pete doing mental calculations, trying to reconcile the young woman he remembered with the decorated veteran standing in front of him. Jesus, Mara, he said softly, how many lives have you saved? I don't keep count, I said honestly. That's not how it works. You do the job in front of you, you take care of your team, you complete the mission. You don't tally up lives saved like points in a game. But even as I said it, I could see people around the table trying to do exactly that calculation, trying to understand the scope of what I'd been doing while they'd been living their comfortable civilian lives. The weight of their realization was palpable. They were looking at someone who'd risked her life repeatedly to protect people she'd never met, who'd made sacrifices they couldn't even comprehend. The Purple Heart, Dad said slowly, his voice thick with emotion I'd never heard from him before. You said you were injured. How badly? I thought about that day. The IED explosion that had thrown me 15 feet and left me with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and shrapnel scars I still carried. I thought about waking up in the field hospital and immediately asking about my team, about the relief I'd felt when I learned everyone had survived. I thought about the weeks of recovery and the way my squad had rallied around me, bringing me contraband snacks and terrible magazines and keeping my spirits up during the long, boring days of healing. Bad enough to earn the medal, I said simply. Not bad enough to keep me from finishing my deployment. The understatement hung in the air, and I could see people struggling to process what I wasn't saying. How badly do you have to be injured to earn a Purple Heart? How much pain do you have to endure to downplay it as casually as I just had? It was Cousin Michelle who asked the question that opened the floodgates. Mara, what else haven't you told us? What other operations were you part of? And suddenly I was tired of protecting them from the truth, tired of making my service smaller and safer than it had been. If they wanted to know who I really was, if they wanted to understand what they'd been dismissing for 5 years, then they were going to get the full story. I was part of the team that helped establish security for 3 different refugee camps, I said, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. I helped train local police forces in counter-terrorism techniques. I was involved in operations that disrupted weapons trafficking networks and helped shut down recruitment centers for extremist groups. With each accomplishment I listed, I could see the shock on faces around the table deepening. These weren't abstract military activities. These were the kinds of operations that made news, that had real impact on global security and humanitarian crises. I also helped coordinate medical supply deliveries to remote villages, assisted in the construction of 2 schools and a medical clinic, and spent my free time teaching English to local children who wanted to improve their education prospects. The humanitarian work seemed to hit my family even harder than the military accomplishments. They could maybe dismiss combat operations as part of a job they didn't understand, but teaching children and building schools was something they could relate to, something that spoke to values they recognized. You built schools? Mom's voice was filled with wonder and something that might have been pride. You never mentioned building schools. I mentioned a lot of things you never listened to, I said. But my voice was gentler now. Every time I called home, I tried to share what we were doing, what the work meant, why it mattered. But you only wanted to hear that I was safe and coming home soon. I could see the weight of missed opportunities settling over my parents like a heavy blanket. 5 years of phone calls where they could have learned about their daughter's accomplishments, 5 years of stories they could have shared with friends and neighbors, 5 years of pride they could have felt instead of vague worry and misunderstanding. There's something else, I said, because I was tired of hiding the most important part of my story. The evacuation operation Mrs. Henderson mentioned? The one with the schoolgirls? I didn't just coordinate it. I led the team that went into the compound to get them out. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the Christmas music seemed to fade into background noise as people processed what I'd just revealed. I'd led the team into danger, not just coordinated from a safe distance. I'd been the one making split-second decisions under fire, the one responsible for getting those girls out alive. You went into combat, Dad said, his voice hollow with belated understanding. You were actually in the fighting. That's what special operations means, I said. We go where the situation is most dangerous, where the stakes are highest, where regular forces can't or won't operate. I could see Uncle Pete shaking his head in amazement. And we've been sitting here for years thinking you were pushing papers at some desk job overseas. That's what you wanted to think, I said bluntly. It was easier than dealing with the reality that your niece was running missions in hostile territory. The accusation hung in the air, and I could see it landing with the force of recognition. They had wanted to believe I was safe and doing nothing important, because the alternative was too scary and too complicated for their comfortable civilian worldview. It was Mrs. Henderson who asked the question that crystallized everything. Mara, dear, how many commendations do you have? How many medals and citations? I thought about the collection in my duffel bag. The Bronze Star and Purple Heart were just the beginning. There were commendation medals for exemplary service, achievement medals for specific operations, unit citations for team accomplishments, campaign ribbons that told the story of where I'd served and what I'd done. 17, I said simply. 17 medals and commendations over 5 years of service. The number seemed to physically stagger my parents. 17 separate occasions when their daughter had been recognized for excellence, courage, or achievement, and they'd known about none of them. 17 times when they could have been proud, could have celebrated, could have told people about their daughter's accomplishments. 17, Mom repeated, her voice breaking on the word. Oh God, Mara, we didn't know. We didn't know any of it. You didn't want to know, I said, and for the first time since I'd walked into the room, my voice carried real anger. You wanted me to be safe and small and forgettable, so that's what you convinced yourselves I was. The truth was harsh and undeniable, and I could see it hitting my family like a series of physical blows. Around the table, the extended family and neighbors were looking at my parents with expressions that ranged from confusion to judgment, trying to understand how they could have been so oblivious to their daughter's achievements. I need to see them, Dad said suddenly, his voice urgent with belated need. All of them. The medals, the citations, everything. I need to see what we missed. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing something in his face I'd never seen before. Genuine regret, mixed with desperate desire to understand what he'd failed to see for 5 years. It wasn't enough to fix what had been broken, but it was a start. They're in my duffel bag, I said finally. In the hotel room. Hotel room? Mrs. Henderson looked confused. Why are you staying in a hotel? This is your family home. The question hung in the air like an indictment, and I could see my parents realize that their guests were beginning to understand exactly what had happened the night before. The story they'd probably planned to tell, that I was busy or had other plans, was crumbling in the face of the truth. Because, I said quietly, when I showed up last night to surprise my family for Christmas, I was told there was no room for me. The revelation hit the table like a bomb. Faces around the room registered shock, then disbelief, then the kind of moral outrage that comes when people realize they've witnessed something genuinely terrible. No room? Uncle Pete's voice was incredulous. For a decorated veteran coming home from deployment? For their own daughter? I could see my parents shrinking under the weight of judgment from people they'd known for decades. People whose opinions mattered to them in ways my opinion apparently never had. The social consequences of their actions were becoming clear, and they were finally understanding that this wasn't just about family dynamics. It was about fundamental decency and respect. We can fix this, Mom said desperately, reaching toward me like she could physically pull me back into the family fold. Mara, honey, we can fix this. You can stay here tonight. We'll make room. We'll figure it out. I looked at her outstretched hand and felt something breaking inside me that wasn't anger or hurt, but something deeper and more fundamental. The realization that an apology couldn't undo 5 years of willful ignorance, that making room for me now didn't erase the fact that they'd turned me away when it mattered. It's too late for that, I said quietly. The damage is done. And as I said the words, I realized they were true. Not because I couldn't forgive them, but because I finally understood that I deserved better than having to earn my place at my own family's table. I deserved better than having to prove my worth through medals and headlines and dramatic revelations. I deserved a family that had been proud of me all along, that had celebrated my service instead of tolerating it, that had seen my absence as sacrifice rather than abandonment. Standing there in my dress uniform, surrounded by people who were finally beginning to understand who I really was, I realized that the most important revelation wasn't about my accomplishments or my service. It was about my worth as a person, and the fact that it had never depended on their recognition or approval. The question now was what I was going to do with that knowledge. The weight of my own words settled over the room like snow falling on a battlefield. Quiet, inevitable, and transforming everything it touched. I watched my parents' faces as they processed what I'd said, watched the hope drain from Mom's eyes and the defeat settle into Dad's shoulders. Around the table, the extended family sat in uncomfortable silence, witnesses to a reckoning that had been 5 years in the making. Mara, Jessica said softly, standing up from her chair with careful deliberation, what do you need from us right now? It was such a simple question, but it cut through all the drama and emotion to the heart of what mattered. What did I need? Not what they wanted to give me, not what would make them feel better about their failures, but what I actually needed to move forward. I thought about it for a moment, standing there in my dress uniform, surrounded by people who were finally seeing me clearly for the first time in years. What I needed wasn't apologies or explanations or desperate attempts to make up for lost time. What I needed was respect for my choices and acknowledgement that I was an adult who could make decisions about my own life and relationships. I need space, I said finally. I need time to figure out who I am in civilian life without having to manage everyone else's guilt or expectations about who I should be. Dad started to protest, his voice rising with the kind of panic that comes when you realize you might have lost something irreplaceable. But you just got home. We can work this out, we can do better, we can… Dad, I said, cutting him off with the quiet authority I'd learned to wield in the military. I've been taking care of myself for 5 years. I've led teams through combat situations and made life-or-death decisions under pressure. I think I can figure out how to navigate Christmas dinner. The words were gentle but firm, and they established something that had been missing from our family dynamic for too long. The recognition that I was an adult who deserved to be treated as an equal rather than a child who needed to be managed or protected. "But where will you go?" Mom asked, her voice small and lost. "What will you do?" I looked at her. This woman who'd raised me and loved me in her own limited way, and felt something shifting inside me that wasn't anger or resentment, but something closer to sad acceptance. She genuinely didn't understand that I had a life outside of their approval, that I'd built relationships and skills and confidence that didn't depend on their validation. "I have options," I said simply. "I have friends from the service. I have opportunities for work. I have a whole life that you never bothered to learn about." The statement wasn't meant to be cruel, but it landed with the force of truth. For 5 years, they'd acted like my existence overseas was a temporary inconvenience, something I was doing to them, rather than something I was building for myself. They'd never asked about my friendships or my career plans or my hopes for the future, so they had no idea what resources I had or what I wanted from life. It was Uncle Pete who broke the silence with a question that surprised everyone. "Mara, what do you want to do now that you're back? Career-wise, I mean." The question was so normal, so genuinely curious, that it felt like a breath of fresh air after all the emotional intensity. Someone was asking about my future rather than relitigating my past, and it reminded me that there were people in this room who were capable of seeing me as more than just the family drama I'd become entangled in. "I'm considering several options," I said, grateful for the chance to talk about something forward-looking. "I've been offered a position with a private security firm that does international work, and there's also an opportunity to work with a nonprofit that helps veterans transition to civilian careers." I could see Jessica's face light up with interest, and Marcus was nodding like he wanted to hear more. Even some of the neighbors looked genuinely curious about what came next for the decorated veteran, who just revealed herself to be far more accomplished than any of them had realized. "There's also the possibility of going back to school," I continued, warming to the subject. "The GI Bill would cover tuition, and I've been thinking about studying international relations or public policy, maybe eventually working in government or diplomacy." The plans I was describing weren't vague hopes or desperate attempts to justify my service. They were real possibilities I'd been researching during my final months of deployment, concrete next steps for a life I'd been planning while my family assumed I was just drifting overseas. "That sounds incredible," Mrs. Henderson said with genuine enthusiasm. "You could probably teach those professors a thing or two about international relations, considering what you've actually experienced." Her words hit home in a way that my family's belated attempts at pride hadn't, because they came from someone who was responding to my accomplishments rather than trying to manage her own guilt. It reminded me that there were people in the world who would value my experience and perspective, even if my biological family had failed to do so. "The point is," I said, looking around the table, "I'm not the lost young woman who left here 5 years ago. I'm not someone who needs to be rescued or managed or protected from difficult truths. I'm a grown woman with skills and experience and plans for the future." I could see my parents struggling to reconcile this reality with their mental image of me as their baby daughter, who needed their guidance and approval. It was painful to watch, but it was also necessary. They needed to understand that their relationship with me going forward would have to be based on who I actually was, not who they remembered me being. "I want to be part of your future," Jessica said quietly. "Whatever that looks like, wherever it takes you. I want to know about your work, and your friends, and your plans. I want to be the sister you deserve." Her words were simple but powerful, and they offered something I hadn't realized I'd been hoping for: the possibility of rebuilding relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. "But it has to be real, Jess. No more managing other people's feelings or making excuses for behavior that shouldn't be excused. If we're going to have a relationship, it has to be based on honesty." She nodded immediately, tears running down her cheeks but her voice steady. "I understand. And I'm sorry it took me so long to stand up for you the way I should have." Marcus cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion when he spoke. "I want the same thing. I want to know my sister. The real one, not the version of you that everyone else was comfortable with." I looked at my siblings and felt something loosening in my chest that had been tight for years. Maybe not all of my family relationships were beyond repair. Maybe some of them could be rebuilt on stronger foundations. "What about us?" Dad asked quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of recognition that he and Mom had done the most damage and had the furthest to go to earn forgiveness. I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine understanding rather than just regret at getting caught in bad behavior. What I saw was complicated. Real remorse mixed with confusion about how to fix what he'd broken. Genuine love tangled up with years of willful ignorance about who I'd become. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I need time to figure out whether we can build something new or whether too much has been broken to repair." The answer clearly wasn't what he'd hoped for, but he nodded like he understood that forgiveness couldn't be demanded or rushed. "What can we do?" Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can we earn another chance?" I thought about the question seriously, because despite everything, these were still the people who'd raised me and loved me in their imperfect way. The relationship was damaged, maybe irreparably, but that didn't mean I wanted to write them off entirely. "You can start by learning who I actually am," I said finally. "Not who you want me to be, or who you remember me being, but who I am now. You can ask questions about my service and actually listen to the answers. You can try to understand why it mattered to me and why it should matter to you." I paused, making sure they were really hearing what I was saying. "And you can stop trying to make my life smaller and safer than it actually is. I'm not the scared teenager who left here 5 years ago. I'm a woman who's seen combat and saved lives and earned the respect of my peers through actions, not words." The requirements I was laying out weren't negotiable. They were the minimum foundation for any future relationship. Either they could accept me as I was, or they couldn't. But I was done shrinking myself to fit into their comfort zone. "We can do that," Dad said quickly, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Don't promise things you might not be able to deliver," I said. "This isn't something you can fix with good intentions and quick commitments. It's going to require fundamental changes in how you think about me and my choices." Around the table, I could see people processing the gravity of what I was saying. This wasn't just about healing hurt feelings or having a nice family reconciliation. This was about whether my parents were capable of evolving beyond the narrow understanding of love and family that had led them to turn away their daughter in the first place. "I think," Uncle Pete said slowly, "that maybe this conversation has been a long time coming. And maybe it needed to happen exactly like this, with all of us here to witness it." His words carried weight, because they came from someone outside the immediate family drama, someone who could see the situation more objectively. The extended family and neighbors had become accidental witnesses to something important. Not just a family fight, but a reckoning with values and priorities that affected how they all thought about service and sacrifice. "I'm proud to know you," Mrs. Henderson said suddenly, her voice firm with conviction. "Proud to have watched you grow up, proud to see what you've accomplished, proud to call you neighbor. Your parents might need time to figure that out, but the rest of us can see it clearly." Her words hit me harder than any of my family's belated attempts at pride. because they came without the baggage of guilt or expectation. She was proud of me simply because my accomplishments deserved pride, not because she was trying to repair a damaged relationship. "Thank you," I said, and my voice was steadier than it had been all day. "That means more than you know." I looked around the table one more time, taking in faces that showed various degrees of understanding, regret, and determination to do better. Some relationships might be salvageable, others might be beyond repair, but for the first time in 5 years, everyone was seeing me clearly. "I should go," I said, adjusting my uniform jacket with military precision. "I have some phone calls to make, and some decisions to think through." "Where?" Jessica asked. "Where will you be?" "Tonight, the hotel," I said. "After that, we'll see. I might visit Rodriguez in Texas for New Year's, or I might drive up to see Johnson in Michigan. I have friends scattered all over the country now, people who understand what the past 5 years have meant." I was describing a support network they'd never known existed, relationships they'd never bothered to learn about, proof that I had a life and connections that didn't depend on their approval. "Will you call us?" Mom asked, her voice small and hopeful. "Will you let us know where you are?" I considered the question carefully. "I'll call Jessica and Marcus. They've earned the right to be part of my life going forward. As for the rest of you—" I paused, making sure my words were measured rather than cruel. "That depends on whether you can prove you're ready to be family in the way that actually matters." It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't forgiveness either. It was a challenge. The opportunity to earn a place in my life through actions rather than expectations. I walked toward the door with measured steps, my uniform making small sounds that seemed louder in the sudden quiet of the dining room. At the doorway, I turned back one more time. "For what it's worth," I said, looking directly at my parents, "I never stopped loving you. But love isn't enough anymore. I need respect and understanding, and the acknowledgement that the woman standing here in uniform has earned both." I left them with that truth hanging in the air, walked through the familiar hallway of my childhood home, and stepped out into the crisp December afternoon. The snow was still falling, transforming the neighborhood into something clean and new, full of possibilities I was finally ready to explore. My phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez. "How's the family reunion going, Sergeant?" I smiled as I typed back, "Better than expected." Turns out, I'm exactly who I thought I was. As I drove away from Maple Street, I didn't look back at the house where I'd grown up. Instead, I focused on the road ahead, on the life I was going to build with people who valued courage and service, and the kind of strength that comes from choosing difficult paths because they matter. I was finally home. Not because I'd returned to a place, but because I'd returned to myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.